Hi, I'm Bob McCoskrie. Hate speech laws continue to be proposed by the Labour government under the pretence of the public good. After all, who can disagree with the idea of banning hate? But beneath the shiny veneer of good intentions lies one of the most dangerous attempts at a law change our country has faced in recent history. After years of debate and 19,000 submissions to a recent Ministry of Justice consultation on 6 changes to expand hate speech laws proposed by the government has finally released its draft hate speech law, proposing just one change to the Human Rights Act. Now, this has been a major backdown, and it's due in part to your voice when we asked you to make a submission to the Ministry of Justice's consultation. You know, despite the country's horror at the terrorist attack in Christchurch and the grotesque ideology behind it, the government does not have the support of New Zealanders for a radical transformation and expansion of so-called hate speech laws. Now, the current law is that it's illegal to publish or distribute threatening, abusive, or insulting words likely to excite hostility against or bring into contempt, whatever that may mean, to any group on the grounds of colour, race, ethnic, or national origins. The government wants to expand these existing legal protections that have been in place since 1993 to also include any group on the grounds of religious belief. Last year, the government released a discussion document, and as I said earlier, it had 6 key proposals that intended to strengthen protections against speech inciting hatred or discrimination, because the government said they didn't believe the law was clear enough. And they specifically highlighted that trans, gender diverse, and intersex people needed to be protected from discrimination. They said the final proposal would make changes to clarify this by changing the word sex, currently understood as biological sex, as would be naturally expected by most of us, changed to include sex characteristics or intersex status, and adding a new ground of gender, including gender expression and gender identity. Here was the announcement on the draft law made by Justice Minister Kiri Allan towards the end of last year. Now note, it was made quietly on a Saturday morning in November on a program that very few were probably watching, News Hub Nation. Friday nights and Saturdays during the day are where a government makes announcements that they're not keen on shouting from the rooftop.
What we are doing, first we are making a simple change to the Human Rights Act, which expands the incitement provision to include religious groups. Secondly, on some of those issues that I think really spiked the ire and were complex, they're challenging. They go to the heart of one of our fundamental freedoms that we all cherish and uphold, our right to freedom of speech. And that rubs up with our obligation to protect those that are most vulnerable within the community. So what we're doing with some of those more challenging areas, we're asking the Law Commission to do a deep dive, help us strike the right balance.
Now, there's 2 really important things to note. The government says it's primarily focusing on a key recommendation of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the 2019 Christchurch terror attack. But here's the problem with that line. In its election manifesto, Labour pledged to extend legal protections for groups that experience hate speech, including for reasons of religion, gender, disability, or sexual orientation. There's the full agenda. And similarly, the Greens have campaigned for several years on expanding hate speech laws on similar categories. And this leads to the second thing to note. This backdown is not really a principled backdown. It's buying some time. The day before the Minister appeared on News Hub Nation, she contacted the Law Commission to basically, in my view, ask for better arguments to get the wider hate speech laws introduced. Because remember, that's their agenda. The Minister wants a deep dive, as she calls it, into legal responses to hate-motivated offending, which is sometimes called hate crime. I mean, isn't all crime a form of hate towards the victim? Legal responses to speech that expresses hostility towards or contempt for people who share a common characteristic. Protections in the Human Rights Act 1993 for transgender people, non-binary people, and people with diverse sex characteristics. If you think that hate speech laws will stop at religious communities, we'd encourage you to think again. This proposal is just step one. It's designed to take the heat off this highly unpopular and controversial issue in an election year, but it will be back. And don't think that the Law Commission will be conservative on this issue. This is the same Law Commission that ignored the weight of submissions, almost 70%, which opposed removing abortion from the Crimes Act. The same Law Commission that recommended removing many of the previous restrictions and safeguards, and they've made abortions that much easier to access with less oversight. They recommended a very liberal law, which we now have in New Zealand, one of the most liberal in the world, sadly. So don't put your trust in the Law Commission necessarily coming back with appropriate proposals on hate speech. Historian and professor Dr. Paul Moon from AUT spoke at our conference 2 years ago on the hate speech law proposal. And so after this recent government backdown, we asked him about the implications of this religious belief change. And which religion or religions is it referring to?
What we're looking at now, though, in terms of religion being included as one of those areas of discrimination, is about bringing it into contempt. And this is where it gets interesting, because you ask the question, which religion? Are we allowed to, or are we going to be prohibited from bringing any religions into contempt? And what's interesting is that this, remember, derives from the Royal Commission report. And that report referred to the religion of ethnic minorities, which required protection. Now that's highly problematic, that statement, because it's assuming if you belong to a particular ethnic minority, you must adhere to a particular religion. And that's a terrible racial stereotype, because the fact is that people from all sorts of ethnic groups adhere to all sorts of religions or none. And we've got to accept that diversity. But the idea that if you belong to this ethnic group, you must therefore belong to this religion, I think is highly generalizing, and that's putting it mildly. But they want to protect the religion of ethnic minorities. And that was the second problem with the Royal Commission's report, is why don't you protect all people's religions? Why only those of ethnic minorities? So there were problems with that as well. So what it looks like the government's done is said, we're going to have a blanket protection for all religions. How this plays out, though, is quite different. This is the key thing, that we can have these things written in statute, but their enactment is another matter altogether.
You see, adding religion could potentially criminalise any or all criticism of religion or religious belief. This places religion above criticism. What really happens when hate speech law is enforced is that the role of the state is changed to decide which religions are valid and which are not. And this has nothing to do with protecting any religion. It's the erosion of freedom and democracy. Hate speech law will simply increase the power of the state to decide what we should say or not say about the nature of truth, because true religion deals in truth. But why is only religion above criticism? Should it be? I don't think so. I'm happy to defend my Christian faith. In fact, ACT leader David Seymour said, "Preventing freedom of expression on religious grounds is a significant restriction. It is important that we are allowed to call out examples of religious persecution without fear of being prosecuted. What is currently happening in Iran is a good example of this." Yep, and you could probably add Afghanistan and a number of other countries where there is religious persecution going on with disturbing effect, which we should call out. In fact, Seymour highlighted that the Royal Commission of Inquiry themselves admitted the problems with introducing hate speech laws. The difference between legally criminalised hate speech and the vigorous exercise of the right to express opinions is not easy to capture in legislative language. As well, the far more reaching a law creating hate speech offences, the greater the potential for inconsistency with the right to freedom of expression. National MP Chris Penk said, "It's inappropriate for this Parliament to be making laws that protect merely the sensibilities of those who have a religious belief or, again, a lack of religious belief." It wasn't that long ago, in fact it was the previous term of Parliament, in which this institution repealed the crime, yes, the crime of blasphemous libel. Yep, that's correct. Just recently, the government repealed the anti-blasphemy law, with then Justice Minister Andrew Little saying the law was medieval, archaic and unjust. And he also said, "This obsolete provision has no place in a modern society which protects freedom of expression. The continued existence of this offence on the statute books was out of place with New Zealand's position as a bastion of human rights, including recognising freedom of expression and religious tolerance for all faiths." Well, this all sounds confusing and contradictory, doesn't it? And that should concern you. Here's something you probably don't need to be reminded of. Some passages from the Bible, for example, are seen as insulting. After all, who wants to be told they're a sinner? Yet the claim that we are all sinners in need of forgiveness is central to the Christian faith and has never been motivated by hate. Quite the contrary. Traditional beliefs about human sexuality and identity, which have been held by the majority of humankind across diverse cultures for thousands of years, are only recently construed as hateful by the LGBT community. But underlying all of this is that one of the most disturbing realities of criminalising hateful speech is that there is simply no agreement on the definition of what constitutes hate speech. And without a clear definition, how will you know when or if you have broken the law? You may recall in 2019 with Duncan Garner on the AM show, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern identified the threshold between reasonable criticism and hate speech as when you see it, you know it.
And even sharing views that people necessarily wouldn't agree with. There's a very big difference between that and language which is designed to try and incite harm against others. And it's kind of examples where when you see it, you know it. There is a threshold there.
When you see it, you know it? In other words, you may not know until afterwards that you've broken the law, depending on who gets upset. And who decides what are insulting words likely to excite hostility or bring into contempt? Who decides harm? The government? The media? Social media outcry? And of course there is the new form of hate speech in the form of disinformation. I'm sure you've heard about it. The Disinformation Project, for example, studies misinformation and disinformation in New Zealand, and they released a report last year which said this: the most recent COVID-19 outbreak and the vaccine are highly visible, potent symbols used to push various far-right and conservative ideologies around issues such as free speech, faith, Christian, evangelical or Pentecostal, abortion, euthanasia, cannabis law reform, families and family structure, LGBTQIA+ rights including conversion therapy, immigration, race and gender. And then the head of the Disinformation Project appeared on a government-funded program on TVNZ called Web of Chaos, where there was an explanation of how certain people, gullible people, become conspiracy theorists and purveyors of disinformation, which has striking consequences for social cohesion and democracy, apparently, according to the producers of this program. Check out the list, and apologies to any mums who may be watching. Apparently, you are the problem.
Want to make jelly on a budget? Grab some lilac.
You can draw people in lots of different places. And each of the platforms are used in different ways.
Hello, friends. As you can see, I'm working on my would-be bag.
What is known internationally as the kind of trad wife set of viewpoints, which is white, Christian, a lot of pseudo-Celtic, pseudo-Nordic ideologies behind it. They use Pinterest and Instagram to draw in other women who are interested in interior design, children's clothing, knitting, healthy food for children. And it does draw people in towards a set of white nationalist ideas. I mean, it's relatively easy to see. If you see a very beautiful, fair-skinned, blonde or red-haired child with beautiful braiding in her hair and some flowers, just step back a little bit.
A beautiful, fair-skinned blonde or red-haired child with braiding and flowers, just step back. And in a recent UN speech, which garnered significant international criticism, and some commentators believe that the negative reaction to this speech may have been part of the reason for the government's partial backdown on hate speech laws, Jacinda Ardern linked the phrase disinformation with weapons, the face of war, and hateful rhetoric.
We will remain a strong and passionate advocate for efforts to address the weapons of old. But we'll also be an advocate to address the weapons that are new. After all, the face of war has changed, and with that, the weapons used. The tools used to challenge the statehood of others are hidden and more complex. Traditional combat, espionage, and the threat of nuclear weapons are now accompanied by cyber attacks, prolific disinformation, and manipulation of whole communities and societies. How do you tackle climate change if people do not believe it exists? How do you ensure the human rights of others are upheld when they are subjected to hateful and dangerous rhetoric and ideology? The weapons may be different, but the goals of those who perpetuate them is often the same.
As you can see, there's a clear underlying narrative and ideology in all of this. Advocates for hate speech laws clearly disagree with a morally conservative or traditional worldview, a Christian worldview. They've made that very obvious. Will these conservative views labelled as disinformation and misinformation be considered hate speech under this proposed law? The finger is generally pointed at conservatives for so-called online hate. Here's a question. Will a biblical worldview such as Israel Folau's or even Family First's be protected under this new law proposed? Remember that we were deregistered because of our views on marriage and traditional family. Can we now be restored to charitable status? And can Israel Folau be restored to play rugby league in Australia and New Zealand and post Bible verses again? I think you probably know the answers to those questions. In a free and open society, distasteful opinions to some people are met with open inquiry, civil dialogue and debate. If I don't like what you say, even if I find it offensive, I meet your ideas with my own in an attempt to discover something approaching the truth. The real effect of hate speech laws is that they will develop a culture of fear and self-censorship for the purpose of political intimidation and control. Thoughts and ideas which are undesirable to special interest groups will be able to be silenced simply by framing them as hateful. And such groups will claim to believe in free speech just as long as it's speech they approve of. Why are only some groups protected and not others? The proposed laws want to protect certain groups. Aren't all humans hurt by hate, regardless of their group membership? Belonging to a group shouldn't afford special protections that result in the removal of the rights of others to disagree with them. Now let's be clear, this does not excuse physical threats or incitement to violence. We should all oppose that. As the Free Speech Union rightly points out, we should simply make incitement to violence as illegal, and incitement to violence against any and all groups. Why highlight some groups for special protection? Let's protect all groups. Let's protect all New Zealanders. And remember, our speech is already limited. There are many things we are not free to speak about. Examples include laws on libel, slander, obscenity, pornography, sedition, incitement, classified information, copyright violation, trade secrets, non-disclosure agreements, perjury, and more. These restrictions on your freedom of speech are widely accepted as part of a civil society. Likewise, threatening and abusive speech is also already banned because of the consequences of harm can be directly linked to the speech in question. Belonging to a group, though, should not afford special protections that result in the removal of the rights of others to disagree with them. Political activists and special interest groups will miss the important distinction between hate speech and merely speech they hate, and they'll end up using such laws as tools of political intimidation to punish opponents and shut down debate in the marketplace of ideas. Hate speech laws must be rejected for the sake of a fair, open and democratic society. So what can you do? Well, go to hatespeech.nz to learn more. Download our fact sheet, which explains all of this in more detail. Read our submission to the Ministry of Justice from 18 months ago. Watch our earlier detailed examination of this issue, which gives you all the background, including some disturbing examples from both New Zealand and overseas. And then make a submission against the proposed bill. Speak to your local members of Parliament. Write to the leaders of political parties. At the moment, Labour, Greens and Te Pāti Māori are supporting hate speech laws. National and ACT are opposing them. Speak up on this issue before it's too late. Go to hatespeech.nz.